welcome Gordon Rothero. He's been visiting Assynt for over 30 years, a long-standing friend of the Field Club. He's a distinguished bryologist, and he's authored numerous papers and books on the subject. And I think, particularly at the moment, with the publicity and the new work on the fact that people are starting to recognise temperate rainforests, which we've got a lot of in Assynt, it's particularly pertinent to hear this talk tonight, I think. But what is a bryologist, you're asking? Gordon, can you tell us, please? So welcome to him, please.
In answer to that, a bryologist is someone who's interested in bryophytes. Bryophytes, as you know, are mosses and liverworts, and for some of us anyway, they become a considerable interest, not to say an obsession. And I'm going to take you through some of the interesting bryophytes that you have in your area here. The area is not very highly populated. There have, as far as we know, never been any resident bryologists, people looking at mosses and liverworts in the area, and so it's always depended upon visitors like myself for the records of the species that we have here and the accounts of the kind of bryophyte communities that we have. To set this scene in some sort of context, it really all starts with this man here. There were records from Sutherland before Mr. Dixon visited with his friends, but they were very, very scattered indeed, and it's quite hard work finding out exactly where the records came from. They often gave a locality as where they were actually staying rather than where they visited. Anyway, Dixon made his visit here for a number of days in 1899, and he made a considerable number of records in West Sutherland, and you can see the kind of areas that they covered. It makes him look very impressive, but you will understand that because of the way that photography has developed and the way that these things tend to work out, people, distinguished scientists or botanists like Mr. Dixon, were only photographed in later life, and you think, well, didn't he do well to do all that when he looks like that? Well, of course he didn't look like that. He was probably in his late 30s when he did this, and so that makes a considerable difference to how you view these older people. We always think of them as being old, but in fact they were young once, just like all the rest of us. There were other visits to West Sutherland in the intervening period. One of his companions, Mr. Nicholson, came in the 1920s and looked at the liverworts in the area. Dixon was a moss man. He didn't really bother about liverworts at all. So Nicholson came up and made a good record of the liverworts in the area, including one particularly nice find, which I'll deal with a bit later on. But the next serious collection of records really dates from 1992. Ian will correct me if I got that wrong. 1992, when the British Bryological Society paid a visit up here. The group here, sitting out near the Bone Cave, has a number of distinguished bryologists present. You can recognise Ian just up the back there, but I'm not thinking about him as a distinguished bryologist. This is a man called Alan Cromwell here, who was at Glasgow University, a very distinguished bryologist, and some of the people down here have become more distinguished bryologists. This is Nick Hodgetts, who now lives on Skye, so some of you may come across his name, and that's me in the middle there. So that was really the start. I came up planning that meeting, and I met Ian and Pat Evans before the meeting, and then as the meeting arrived, I turned up at their doorstep wanting a shower because I've been out in the hills for a number of days, and really I've never really moved away since then. And I've been coming up here on a regular basis for some 30 odd years, and was inveigled into producing a Bryophyte section for the flora of Assynt during that period. So what were we looking at? We were looking at a whole variety of habitats in West Sutherland. One that's already been mentioned now, and I'll deal with it now, is the woodland areas that we have in Sutherland. It's not a particularly well-wooded county compared with other parts of Scotland, but it does have some nice areas of woodland, and you know, we do have a number of interesting species which are woodland species, and a lot of them are very characteristic of this newly found interest that we have in the temperate rainforest. The indicator species, they are, well, I find them extremely attractive. I think they're beautiful. They are often associated they're often associated with woodlands with decent ravines in them. This, to be fair, is not really woodland. This is I think it's in the Cromwell Hills.
Yeah.
But it's a ravine, and it has, you know, interesting species. In general, most of the species that are of interest in the temperate rainforest are liverworts rather than mosses, although there are plenty of mosses as well. This one particular group is this species of Bryological, and I'll make apologies right from the beginning. You're going to get lots of Latin names, I'm afraid. There is a list of English names that have been made up, but I'm afraid I just don't know them. I only know the Latin names, so that's what you're going to get. This is a group called Bryological. This is Bryological punctata, and because of where we are in the west of Scotland, we have the bulk of the world population of this particular species in the west of Britain, really, in the west of Ireland, simply because of where we are. So it's an attractive species, and it has great long teeth on the leaves. And people often ask, what's the difference between mosses and liverworts? Well, mosses never ever have teeth on the leaves like this. Other species, this is a thing called Lepidosia cupricina, again absolutely limited to the west coast of Britain and Ireland, and a few places on the west of Europe, on the coastline in France and Spain. It's absolutely beautiful, forms these really dense cushions, and although you can't see it in the photograph there, again the leaves have great long cilia on the end of the leaf, which look almost like a hand sticking out from the stem.
Is that part of it, or is that an interloper?
That's an interloper there, yeah. That's a moss called Dicranum scoparium there, which is abundant all over Scotland. Another denizen of the what I call Atlantic oak woodlands, what we now call temperate rainforest, is this Radula aquilegia, a very attractive species growing on mats that are well affixed to the rock, quite inflated lobes on the top, and quite a complicated structure underneath, but again it needs an effort to take it back and look at it through a microscope to understand the full complexity of a species like this. All of those are relatively large species. They're quite easy to see, and you don't even really need a hand lens to recognise them. Other species, again characteristic of the rainforests, are very, very much smaller. This one here is probably less than a millimetre across, in effect. Each one of those stems is less than a millimetre across, and obviously only a few millimetres long. And it is, again, quite complex. If you can look closely, they've got quite strong points to the leaf, but have got a lobe underneath as well, which is hollow just to hold the water. And this labours under the name of Drepanologia hamatifolia, a tiny thing with 13 syllables to the name. Casting your mind back to the Radula aquilegia that I showed you a couple of slides back, this is quite instructive, I hope. One of the determining factors of the distribution is the number of wet days during the year. That's days with at least a millimetre of rain, and the map on the right shows the distribution of those areas with wet days. It could be a map. The title could be "Where Not to Go for Your Holidays." The important thing with the rainfall is this number of wet days. The fact that the rainfall that we have is spread through the year rather than being in one season. And the other factor, of course, is the temperature doesn't vary much either. We tend to have cool, wet winters and, cool, wet summers as well. So not much temperature variation, and it gives us a very, very oceanic climate, which is limited to a very, very small number of places in the world. As you can see, the distribution pattern of Radula aquilegia really fits so well with the number of wet days, and that's the case with quite a number of our oceanic species. The number of wet days is the controlling factor. So temperate rainforests, this is the global distribution of temperate rainforests. Nearly always along coastlines, often exposed to oceanic climates. The difference being the area in the Himalaya here, and that's in an area, and sort of eastern China as well. And that's in the area where they get a double monsoon in the year, so that also means that the rain is spread more through the year, and the rainforest in that area tends to be at a much higher level than it does here, where it is mostly coastal, and so that explains that big area there. But shifting on to some different habitats, and talking about the bryophyte communities that we have, we're going to go to Shagra. This is the coastline north of Shagra. Torridonian sandstone, all falling to bits, leaving this particular pillar, which Ian and I have christened the baboon because of its shape, and because of the cover provided by these boulders here, it gives us a similar oceanic effect to the woodland, and in this place there are quite a number of rare species just growing on the thing. This is the thing called Acrobulbus wilsonii, a rare species, and limited in this in Europe to west of Scotland, west of Ireland, with one site on the Faroes, and it doesn't occur again until you get down to what's called Macaronesia, which is Tenerife, Madeira, the Azores. So it's that kind of distribution. It doesn't occur at all on mainland Europe. So again, just an indication of how important our bryophyte flora is. Moving to Shagra gives me a chance to say something else about our flora, something that again is amazing really. This is a species called Myurium hochsteteri. It occurs to a limited extent on the mainland. It's at Stoer, just out there. It's also at Shagra and at Old Shore Moor. And it's more frequent out on Harris and Lewis, and to a certain extent on some of the other outer isles. But it is quite very oceanic. It's limited to this, and quite close to it at Shagra is this species. I confess this photo wasn't taken at Shagra, but anyway, the species here is a thing called Sanionia orthocetoides. And it's scattered around the coast of Scotland, particularly in Auckland, Orkney and Shetland, and on the north, along the north coast, and down the east coast of Scotland to a certain extent. A few years ago, I ran a meeting for the Nordic Bryological Society, and I took them to Shagra to show them various things. And I showed them the Myurium, and very close by we saw the Sanionia. And one of the Norwegian members of the party said, the last time I saw Myurium, it was on one of the islands in the Azores, and the last time I saw the Sanionia, it was in Svalbard. And that gives you an idea of this really odd juxtaposition that we have here of these species. We have a really oceanic species with its centre of distribution in Macaronesia in the Azores, and then we have another species here which is really an Arctic species. Its global distribution is basically along the north coast of Norway up to Svalbard, along the northern coast of Siberia, in Greenland, Jan Mayen Land, and in the very north of Canada. So an Arctic species and an oceanic species meeting very close together, and that is the story of the flora in the west coast of Scotland, or in the north of Scotland really. In fact, we have these two elements that meet together. And you can see that with other species too. This is one of the most beautiful mosses going. This is Tilium crista castrensis, which I think is called the ostrich plume moss or something. But you can see why it's called that. Very pinnate branching. It looks like little feathers sticking up out of the woodland floor. And that is very much a northern boreal montane species with global distribution spread circumpolar really all the way around the northern hemisphere. A woodland species, and that occurs not too far away from something like this, which is a little thing called Glyphomitrium, where the distribution is limited to, I think there's one record in the Faroes, and then it's again down to Macaronesia and that area. I think there might be the odd record in northwest Spain, but I'm not sure about that. And there's one record in southwest Norway. But again, it's the combination of the Arctic, boreal and the oceanic species that give us such a diverse flora. In Sutherland, where we have something like more than 600 species of moss and liverwort, out of a total Scottish flora of about 1,000. So we have a huge proportion of the Scottish flora in Sutherland. There are lots of other habitats. Yeah, sorry, you're going to get a few pictures of that. That's quite well up the back there. The loch margins are quite interesting. Very rocky places, and there are a number of characteristic species, of which this is one. This is Orthotricum rupestris. These cushions here are what we're looking at, and in more detail that's what it looks like. Quite an easy species to recognise because it often has capsules, and the capsules have caps on that are very hairy. You can pick them out quite easily. There are a number of other species along the loch margins, but rather a special one is this one here. All this loch growing here, which is actually abundant in one small area of Loch Assynt. We're looking up Loch Assynt towards Insterdam. And this one has a story. This is called Grumia elatior, and it was long assumed to be extinct in Britain. It was recorded from Glen Clover in the east of Scotland, and from that area there are huge herbarium specimens. I'm talking dinner plate size patches of the stuff in packets in the herbaria, but no one had seen it for years. And then it was found in East Sutherland initially. This is Marianne's Rock near Rogart. Some of you may know, just past Rogart there's a big crags up on the left hand side, and there's a place there. Anyway, a place that I've been meaning to visit, but I never went there, and somebody else did and found species again. And then a few years later, I sent a specimen of this off to another expert who was good at the species, and he identified it as Grumia elatior. And in fact, there's a huge population on Marianne's Rock, on Loch Assynt, sorry. Moving on to coastline, and particularly the sand dunes. This is that man again. This is a Keervaig going out towards Cape Wrath, and there's nice sand dune system there, and a wonderfully scenic place. I don't know, I mean, most of you will have been there, but you know, if you haven't, you ought to go. It is beautiful. There's a nice bothy there as well. But the best sand dune area that there is in West Sutherland is at Inverness, near to Betty Hill. Really big dune system there, and very interesting bryophytes. Very characteristic species like this thing called Entodon consinus. Very, very common on our western sand dunes. And then there are the wetter areas where you have some sort of fresh water flowing through, and there's a whole set of rare species that grow in that habitat, which are considerably threatened because for some reason or other sand dunes are favoured by developers for doing all sorts of things like creating golf courses and caravan parks and whatever else. So this is Entodon, and this is, as I say, it's a common species on the shell sand dunes, where you have the sand is composed of the sand grains, but also the mashed up shells of molluscs, which provide the calcium that gives it the oomph. Here's one of the rarities. This is Bryum calophyllum, which occurs in some abundance in one or two places at Inverness, and it's limited to about 5 localities now in Britain, and again just really threatened by just development. Really, it needs that flow of fresh water through the site where it grows, and the trouble is getting fresh water through that's not eutrophicated can be very difficult, and it's causing problems at some sites. Other things that happen that you couldn't really predict, although it's not in West Sutherland, it does occur at Acton on the sand dunes there, but there the air, almost conversely, the area there where it occurred was kept open by the campsite that was there, and since the campsite's gone and the grazing has been taken off the site, the vegetation has got very coarse, and Bryophytes is still there, but it's really suffered. Other things at Betty Hill, this is a thing called Tortella fragilis, because the tips of the leaves are very fragile. And while I've got that name up there with the fragilis, I will digress and say that one thing people don't really understand about bryophytes is the fact that many of them do not produce sporophytes. That's sexual reproduction. A lot of them get around simply by fragmentation, as in this case, sometimes with special organs like the very fragile leaf apices. Sometimes they have special constructs called gemmi or bulbils, and each part of a bryophyte can reproduce, can become a new plant. So, as I was saying earlier on, if you have a mortared wall covered in moss and you try and wire brush the moss off, then the moss just says, great, thank you, because it's being spread all over the place by your wire brush, and each little bit is capable of producing a new plant. But obviously it'll just be a clone. It won't be a sexual production, because what we see with the bryophytes is the gametophyte. We don't see the sporophyte. That's the gametophyte there. The sporophyte is limited to the structure that's produced once at the diploid stage. Moving into the mountains, this is Benenfuren, and this is the site where Mr. Nicholson found a particular liverwort, an Astrophyllum Jurgensenii, which is how he named it, which was then known only from here and from one or two sites in western Norway. Later on, once we started, well, not me particularly, but once the molecular work went on with some of these species, they realised, in fact, that the species from Benenfuren and the species in western Norway, in fact, weren't the same species. Once they barcoded them, they came out as different species. And the species here is an Astrophyllum alpinum, which is this species here. And it's part of a particular community that we have in the northwest of Scotland, which also occurs to a more limited extent in western Norway, and again to a more limited extent in southwest Ireland, but it doesn't occur again anywhere until you get to the eastern Himalaya, where the similar species occur as a community. I'll explain more about that in a moment. There are a number of other species in this oceanic montane heath. There's the Astrophyllum alpinum here. We do have a true Astrophyllum Jurgensenii in Sutherland, but it is much rarer than alpinum. This is abundant everywhere. Every time you go onto a boggy piece of ground in west of Sutherland, you will get this species. This is Pleurosa purpurea, another big liverwort, which has got a really weird distribution. Again, it occurs where you would expect it to, given its abundance here. It doesn't occur, it occurs in southwest Ireland, but it doesn't occur anywhere in England at all, or Wales. It occurs in western Scotland and the west of the United States, but it also occurs in the Caribbean, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but it does occur there. But as I say, it's really abundant in the west of Scotland. Another one with a weird distribution, this is Plagiochyla carringtonii. It's frequent in the west of Scotland, particularly frequent in parts of West Sutherland, and it doesn't occur again until you get down to South America. Again, how do we explain this kind of distribution? There are lots of theories, but it's very difficult to prove the theories. Mixed up with it there is another species that is called Herbertus, and that's locally, again, locally abundant in West Sutherland, and again it has the same kind of distribution, although it's rather more widespread than the Plagiochyla. This is Scapania nimbosa. It's called, the English name of that is actually rather a pleasant name. It's called cloud earwort, and it is distinguished by its colour and by these great long curved teeth on the margin of the leaf. And again, that is locally frequent in West Sutherland. Global distribution, there you go. So it's very rare in Western Norway, it's very rare in Ireland, locally frequent in Western Scotland, and it doesn't occur again until you get to the Eastern Himalaya. And that dot there should actually be a lot bigger because it goes into Eastern China. These things out there in the Himalaya, again, are locally abundant, and they occur under the rhododendron forest. They don't occur under rhododendron here, unfortunately. And the distribution patterns that we have of these are called disjunct distributions simply because they're a long way apart, and these are the list of species that form the oceanic montane heath that we have, and that gives the kind of distribution of them. We don't have all of those in Sutherland. We have most of them, but not all of them. And as you can see, just by reading through, it's a really, really weird distribution. That distribution pattern is not absolutely restricted to the liverworts. There are one or two mosses with a similarly disjunct distribution. That's a waterfall that some of you will be familiar with. It's got a name. So
Wailing Widows.
Wailing Widow Falls, yeah. Just on the way up the zigzags. And on the ledges down here, there is a lot of the Herbertus that I showed you in the picture, but also this moss here, Chionoloma recurvifolia, which is a really pretty thing. And again, the distribution pattern of that is west of Scotland, one or two sites in Wales. several sites in the southwest of Ireland, and doesn't occur again until you get to Vancouver Island and Western Canada. Again, no easy explanation for this, particularly as it's never been known to produce a sporophyte. Right. Not always an easy topic, but I'll say it anyway. The distribution of that oceanic montane community of hepatics, there's no doubt that it has been limited by the practice of muirburn over a long period of time, and it is very bad news for Bryophytes muirburn. It does kill them fairly effectively, and they recolonise relatively quickly, but only the common species recolonise. The rarer things take a very, very long time to come back. Right, moving on to another habitat very close to us here in Assynt. This is the limestone at Inchdamph and up at the Bone Cave. That's the Bone Cave crags up there. And that's the river. It's been a popular area, as I said. That picture that I showed at the beginning was taken at the Bone Cave, and so there were lots and lots of records from here and from the limestone at Inchdamph on the crags there and up the Trallegill Valley. But the thing about popular sites is that they're popular because they're usually got interesting things growing there, and it's often the best place to try and find different things as well. And I was up there with Ian and Gwen. We were going to see that sinkhole, weren't we, Ian? Mm. Yeah, over the back.
Trainite, yeah.
Yeah. And I just stopped at one of the boulders on the way up, and I saw this tiny little thing growing over the lichen there on the boulder, and I thought it looked vaguely familiar, but I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And then when I got it back to look at it under the microscope, I realised it looked a wee bit like something that I'd seen in the Pyrenees. But I couldn't believe that something that I'd seen in the Pyrenees could possibly occur in the north of Scotland, although the limestone substrate was absolutely right. But then I found out that it actually occurs in Norway as well, and this is Microhypnum salteri, which was new to the British Isles when we found it. So there are still new things to be found in old places. There are lots of other nice things on the limestone too. This is Hypnum bambergeri and other Hypnum species. Again, the only other sites for this in Britain are down in the Bridalban Hills, Ben Lawes, Ben Heskenig, all the way through to Ben Doran, in that area of the Central Highlands. And then there's a big jump until we get up into the limestone here in Inchdamph. Just above the Bone Cave there's a waterfall, a limestone with caves in it there, and this is a friend of mine, Richard Lansdowne, who's taking pictures of this particular species, not a very attractive moss, but this is Selageria trifaria, which grows on wet limestone, often covered in gunge, algal gunge, and so it's often quite hard to pick out, but it's very small. You wouldn't believe it from this picture, but it is a small plant. But because the leaves are trifarious, it means that they're cut off strictly in 3 ranks, it means that, that the shoots are very angular, so you can actually recognise it fairly easily. There are other nice things up there on the limestone. This is a lovely patch of holly fern, and that's just a part of the pleasure of getting to these nice places, is that there are always nice things to see. Trying to find variety elsewhere, you often have to search out crags, because a lot of these species prefer a firm substrate. They can't easily compete in the grassland here, because the vascular plants and some of the bigger bryophytes just outcompete them completely. And so the variety down in here is going to be less than it is along the base of the crags, and even up the crags in some instances. And what you get on the crags can be nice cushions like this. This is a thing called Anoectangium aestivum, which forms these big bright green cushions, usually where there's a little bit of base enrichment. But this is a crag on the way up to Ben Lloyd, I think. Yeah.
Middle of nowhere.
Yeah. The exception to the competitive exclusion of bryophytes from the ground, other than substrates, other flushes, and there are lots and lots of flushes in Sutherland, and most of them have this particular species. This is Scorpidium scorpioides, red wriggly worms, it looks like, and it often occurs with Schinus, in the Schinus mires, and unfortunately the minerals that encourage Schinus seem to be anathema to most bryophytes, but Scorpidium seems to like it, and there are 2 or 3 others that quite like the Schinus flushes, and so it's nearly always the case you find a Schinus flush and you find 5 or 6 species, and that's it. One of the species that you might find, particularly in the more upland flushes, is this Calliogon trifarium. Again, smaller green wriggly worms, often creeping through the red wriggly worms, as it is here, only they're not quite so red. And that's quite a rare species. Other species in flushes, again, somewhat rarer than those 2. This is Corygerag on the back of the north side of Garsven, is it? Clashven. So the road is down there somewhere. And it's a lovely corrie, and it's not too hard to get into. It's quite an easy walk. Where I'm taking the picture from, up beyond this here, is a lovely line of flushed grassland, and in that there are a couple of species. This one here is Plaginium medium. Again, records of that, the first record I think in Sutherland, and again its centre of distribution is right down in the Central Highlands, again Ben Lawes, right the way across to Ben Nevis, that sort of area. And also in the grassland there, although I didn't identify it at the time, was that particular species there, which is Dicranum spadicium, which is again only got half a dozen sites in Scotland, was discovered new to Scotland only sort of 10 or 12 years ago. But it's quite a distinctive species once you know what to look for, and there's quite a good population of it in that flush at the back of that corrie. there, which makes it quite a distinguished spot. The tops of the hills are, they can be interesting, but quite often they're quite loose, particularly on the quartzite. There are some nice things there, like Minuatia sedoides, with the yellowy green flowers, which in fact was first described from Britain on Ben Clibberec, so we can claim in West Sutherland as being of interest from that point of view. It is again quite frequent on hills further south as well, but it's always quite a nice thing to see. There can be rarities there as well in this kind of terrain. This is a wood rush. This is Ludula arcuata, and I'll tell this story. Sorry, Ian. You will notice that down here on these, you see the lovely little droplets, of water. Can you see them? Mm-hmm. Well, the flower head here was covered in those droplets too. It was a really, really good photogenic shot. But unfortunately, somebody decided that it needed to have the water removed, so the walking stick came along and got rid of the water.
That was Canis, wasn't it?
That was on Canis, yeah.
Stopped in was the one to find it.
This is looking at Conival. I confess this is looking at Conival from the wrong side, from the West Sutherland point of view, but I thought you could allow me Conival as being closed anyway. There's a big quartzite crag right at the top here, so very, very close to the Sutherland boundary, which is up here, West Sutherland boundary. And on that there is a fantastic stand of this Andrea nivalis, and the most northerly stand in Scotland. It's a montane species, needs snow cover for much of the year, and it doesn't occur in the Lake District or Wales or in Ireland, but again it's abundant, locally abundant in parts of the Alps and in Norway, but a real montane species. On Conival, on the proper side, there are some stands of this particular species. This is a saxifrage, Saxifraga nivalis, Alpine saxifrage, yeah. But to get to that on Conival, you have to scramble up some quite steep ground. But it's worth making the effort. It's a very pretty thing.
What is the orange growing on this site?
Well, that will be Trentipolia, yeah.
So now we'll get.
Is that the same thing that grows on the bridge, just like Lochender?
Aye.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, on the shady side of walls and things like that.
Right. It's often a sign of something moderately base rich.
It's a partner in a number of lichens. It's the oval partner.
Carrying on with the mountain side of things, this is Ben Hope, taken from the other side of the Hope Valley, looking onto the northwest face. Very impressive from this point of view. All these impressive crags here, but in fact the bit that we're interested in, or I'm interested in, is this band along here, all the way along the slope here. And in fact that area there is the most interesting part, and just from there. There are other things on the mountain that are quite interesting. Over the back of the mountain there are really good stands of that oceanic montane heath. There's also lots and lots of juniper in the heath as well, with Arctostaphylos alpinus, the Arctic alpine bearberry. But the real diversity is along this craggy slope here, and it involves quite a lot of up and down. It is quite strongly calcareous, although it's moin schist. It's a band of the moin schist that's got a reasonable amount of calcium in it, and so we have quite big stands of this nice ledge community. On the rocks down below we have mountain avens, and then there's globeflower and downy willow, Salix lapinum, and there's probably a few other things scattered in there as well. There are a number of interesting vascular plants along that slope there. It's really the only site certainly in Sutherland where we have something like the richness that you have on the calcareous schist hills in the Central Highlands. And so you have, it's the only place in Sutherland, I think it's the only place north of the Bryological hills where you have netleaf willow, Salix reticulata, just one patch in one area on those crags, but a very pretty thing to look at, particularly with the catkins growing, and there's lots of alpine lattice mantle obviously. And we have Pontilla crancii, alpine cinquefoil, so it looks a bit like tormentil that you'll know, but it's bigger, and it has 5 petals rather than 4 petals, and it has these palmate leaves. And the real rarity there is Minuartia rubella. Again, the only other sites in Britain are on Bedlores in 1 or 2 places, and also in the Ben Order area, where there is limestone at quite high altitude. I did a survey of this species some years ago, and took photographs and put pegs in the ground and all sorts of stuff. And somebody went back and they couldn't find any of them there. But I gather that somebody else has been back and has now found 2 clumps of it left, whereas I had something in the 20s, I think, in terms. So it's obviously struggling. Anyway, on with the Bryophytes. This is, I can't say that it's very beautiful, but it is quite interesting. This is Gymnomichum corallioides. You can't see them, but because the leaves are so closely pressed against the stem that you really cannot make out the individual leaves until you get it under a microscope and squash it and force the leaves apart, and so you can see what's going on with them. But it is again one of these things that's really quite rare, and the very few sites in the north of Scotland. This is Encalyptra alpina, again occurs up on Ben Hope, on that band of rocks there. It also occurs on just one boulder, as far as we know, below the Bone Cave, and there are again no other sites until you get down to Ben Lawes area. So it really is quite a special place on Ben Hope. And the rock is calcareous, but it's certainly very funny rock. And this green stuff there is what we call a copper moss. So it likes heavy metal. And we're not talking about music here, we're talking about elements within the rock, and this particular species prefers to grow on that kind of ground, and as a result there are only 2 other sites in Britain where this moss occurs. One in Yorkshire on a very funny rock type, again in another one in Corricanda near to Braemar, and this small population here on Ben Hope. This is Melichophyria, that's a difficult word to say, Melichophyria elongata. And again, as I say, it's just limited to one small area of those crags, as far as we know. Moving on now to boggy ground further north in the county. This is a mire quite close to Ben Loyal. Those of you who know Ben Loyal will recognise the mountain in the background. This is Sphagnum Biotuc. It used to be nice and simple because it was just called Sphagnum fuscum because it's brown, and it's brown all the way through. It looks like, I always liken it to smoker's lungs through. I think it has that kind of brown colour all the way through the cushion, and it tends to form these big hummocks. But as the way things go with bryophytes, as with many other things, the molecular boys got at it, and girls got at it, and split the species into 2. So this is one of the species. This is Sphagnum Biotuc. Here on the mire below Ben Loyal. Often along with Sphagnum Biotuc, we have big hummocks of this particular species, which forms very, very dense hummocks indeed. You can get your fist on them and bang, bang, bang on them, and it sounds as if you're hitting on some wood. This is Sphagnum austinii. So that's 2 different species of sphagnum, and just to point out that there are other species mixed up in this here, and I hope you recognise that you can actually tell the difference between them. They do look different, and in fact there are 30 odd different species of sphagnum in Scotland, so quite a big group to get a hold of, but they are incredibly important. If you put a leaf of sphagnum under the microscope, what you see is this kind of pattern. This is Sphagnum austinii, and the distinguishing feature of Sphagnum austinii is that it has these plate-like lamellae sticking out from the green bits, all this stuff here, and nothing else has that kind of structure. But the general point I want to make is that this is what the structure of a sphagnum leaf looks like. These are the cells that do the photosynthesizing. These are the green cells, and in between them there are these hyaline cells that are completely empty, and they have pores in them where the water can get in and presumably can get out, but obviously quite hard work getting out from that. And as a result, they retain a lot of water, and so and it's a mechanism for staying turgid for longer. It also means that the habitat that they're in remains permanently waterlogged, and so the rate of disintegration, the rate of breaking down, is really quite slow compared with a more aerobic rotting down process. And it means that the structure of the sphagnum is maintained much more so than many other plants. I think the figures are something like about a 15%, only a 15% loss of structure as they begin to rot down, whereas most other things are over 50% loss of structure. And this means that they accumulate, as we know, and the accumulation that they make is what we call peat. And it means that the sphagnum mosses are the only ones that have ever had any real economic value. And you know, they were important, particularly in the west of Scotland, as a source of fuel, but also more recently, particularly in Ireland, they even had power stations fueled by peat. The point that people are making these days is the important one, that because of that process of fixing the structure of the moss, not losing the structure, it means that they capture carbon very effectively. And the northern peatlands of Europe have got more carbon sequestered away than the whole of the rainforests in South America. So they are incredibly important in terms of a carbon sink. And because of global warming, we are in danger of losing that to a certain extent, and the peat is beginning to break down and release the carbon. So it's another negative feedback, if you like, from a global warming process, whereby more carbon may be released into the atmosphere. You need to be careful when you explore the boggy ground. To be fair, this wasn't looking for mosses, this was looking for Rhynchospora fusca, brown-beak sedge. And I have to confess, I reached for the camera before I reached for anything to help me back out again. Right, a final shot again of a nice peat area, a rare species, all this brown stuff. Down here is Sphagnum pulchrum, a beautiful species, and that's been Cliberec in the background there. And just to say that these peatlands are incredibly important, and in their way they are as important as the temperate rainforest. Unfortunately, both areas are getting some support these days, whereas when I first came up to Scotland trying to talk to forestry people about bryophytes, you're wasting your time. But most foresters now know what a bryophyte is, and that's a big step forward. And peatlands, yeah, well, we know the peatlands are really important, and there are all sorts of schemes afoot to protect them, which is a good thing. Right, thank you. British Bryological Society has got a wonderful website, so if you are interested in bryophytes at all, it's the first port of call. And as I say, a fantastic area that you live in. And if you could be bothered making the effort, there is a lifetime's worth of interest there, I promise you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Just for following on from your comments about peat, I think the March talk is someone from the Flow country who will talk about because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. So Roxanne's coming in March, so that should be an interesting one. Before I open the floor for questions, over the years you must have surveyed the same places many times. Have you noticed any change in the distribution or the sort of health of
the sorts of areas that I've done most of my monitoring work on are the snowbed areas in the Cairngorms.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there I've got fixed point photograph sites of the snow beds up there with important bryophyte dominated patches of vegetation where the snow lies often into July, August, and yeah, those areas are creeping in at the edges. It's not easy to be absolutely precise about the rate of change, because inevitably with a community of species, different species respond in different ways, and so it's not just a whole community changing, certain species change, and so the distribution of things changes to a certain extent. But yeah, it's not looking good. Other areas where I have some monitoring further south, the problem there is mostly invasive species, particularly rhododendron, which is not such a problem up here, although I think it's pretty bad at Akfari, isn't it, that area there?
They've been hacking it there.
Have they really?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it is a problem, and that has caused some difficulty. Other than that, certain things cause some changes, and I'll say this now. For bryophytes in particular, total exclosure of grazing is really, 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 really bad news. So it just means that the little things growing on rocks, low down, or base of trees or whatever, they just get completely covered. Up here it tends to be coarse grasses and leggy heather. Further south where I am, it's often bramble, and they just can't compete, and so they just disappear. And so you're just creating yet another barrier for the expansion of the rarer species. They're already trapped in islands because of the amount of Sitka spruce planting, and I'm quite happy to say that we definitely need commercial forestry. We have to have commercial forestry. We still import more timber than China into this country, so we definitely need more commercial forestry, but we need to have a strategic plan. So getting back to your question, yes, things do change. Some things are actually a lot better now. As I said, one of the most important things is that people are actually concerned about bryophytes. They know what bryophytes are now, and that wasn't the case when I moved up here in, 81 or something. So
interesting what you're saying about the grazing.
Yeah.
We had Oliver Moore on, and as a result of his work up at Torbreck, that's where the idea of just stock fencing that area of woodland came about. So you can keep the sheep out, but you can keep, there's minimal grazing by deer.
Yeah.
Because you want something to eat the grasses.
Just try and keep some of the more aggressive species down. Yeah. I mean, it is difficult because we need more woodland, but the trouble is that fencing seems to be the default option. If you're creating a woodland, you put up a fence, and often a deer fence, and I just wish that there was another way, or at least there was financing for another way, and the obvious thing is just to shoot more deer.
Or introduce wolves or something.
Or introduce wolves, yeah. Good luck with that one.
Any questions? Any more questions? Yeah.
Can I ask, it might sound a silly question, but where you've got these cushions and lots of these little, like saying on the photographs, the little leaves, is that one plant?
Yeah.
Or is it? Oh, it is.
Well, it's a clone, so
it's not a collection of lots of plants with their own roots, it seems.
In a sense, it is. But you know, it may well differ from one clump to another. I suspect all those cushions started off as just one stem initially, and they would split and split again and split again and split again. And you know, the cushions that I showed on them were possibly 20, 30, 40 years old. And so whether they're all still the same plant, it's difficult to say. They were all the same plant to begin with, but they are the same genetic entity. They're just a clone of what went on.
And you've got the root going into the rock?
No. No, they don't. They don't have roots. They have structures that look a bit like roots, but they're not. They're just for attachment. They're called rhizoids, and they have no function other than attaching the moss to the substrate.
They photosynthesize, don't they? They're not like air plants, or are they?
Oh no, they photosynthesize, yeah, they're desiccatorial plants.
Yeah.
They are the original, they are the basal group of all land plants.
Yeah.
They emerged about 450 million years ago. So they bridge the gap between algae and the flowering plants that we see all around us. And they've been around a very, very long time, and they have colonised just about every habitat apart from the sea. We don't have any maritime bryophytes.
Although moss do live in water.
Sorry?
Mosses do live in water?
Yes, they live in water, and they need water. It's obviously every plant needs water, but there's something. Quite a number of plants have adapted to desert living, particularly where they make do with just dew formation, and they shut up shop for weeks at a time, and then just start again as soon as they get enough moisture. The one important time that they need moisture is to get the male gametes to the egg. So there has to be, the male gamete has to swim to the egg, has to have some method of getting from the male inflorescence to the female inflorescence, and there has to be some water to do that. Otherwise there won't be the sporophyte can't form. I could have given you technical stuff with this, but I thought it would probably be a bit much.
Has anybody done any work on, you mentioned some of these rare species that are very isolated and don't produce spores. Has anybody done any work in sort of, transplanting, moving them, or is that
very little work has been done transplanting bryophytes. It's usually come about through some kind of threat to them. So, for instance, I don't know if any of you are aware of it, but it was a big hydro scheme put in above Fort Augustus, the big Glendo scheme, and exactly where they were putting the dam, there was a rare bryophyte grew there, and they got me to go up and harvest clumps of this moss, which was quite abundant in that particular spot, but it was exactly where they put the dam, and I transplanted it in various places up there, and that was relatively successful. But I've also tried it with another rare species. It's only British site in the Two Hills near Stirling, and I tried transplanting that, but the habitat was changing so quickly there. No good at all. Although they're still talking about trying that one again. In terms of some of the other things, the oceanic hepatics, the big Herbertuses and the Scapanias, there have been some transplant work done on that, but then the woman who was doing it, Marin, moved to Spain and had children, so that kind of put a stopper to that. But her sites are still there, so it would be possible for someone to go back, but I'm too old and too knackered to go up there anymore. So I did try transplanting some of those things from the hill into my back garden in Argyll, and I poked them into bits of moss and, under a boulder in my back garden, and okay, they said, yep, here we are, and they just sat there and did nothing. They didn't die, but they didn't do anything else either.
Just an observation, Gordon. Just sorry, not a question. Sorry, it's just There's no maritime bryophytes.
There are mosses that survive with some spray, some sort, and they don't do well away from it. So there's a thing called Schistidium maritimum, which occurs all around the shores of Western Scotland. It'll be everywhere here.
Because a lot of these things, the bryophytes here, even further away from the coast than that species, then they're getting hammered by salt air.
Yeah, they don't like it very much, or some of them don't like it, some of them do, and so there are some crags. If you find a crag with Asplenium marinum on it, away from the shore, it's not much point in looking for any bryophytes there either. But as I say, the one that we do have, Schistidium maritimum, occurs on rocks on the seashore where it gets covered with spray and waves fairly regularly. And just as a matter of interest, you can also find it from a Barra Head, 400 metres up in the air, where the spray just show how much spray there is in the outer isles.
The more common or robust ones, could you order those online for your garden?
I don't think the only mosses you can buy tend to be sphagnum, the bog mosses, and some of the big robust mosses, because people use them to stuff into hanging baskets and things like, or for floral displays and that kind of thing. And I'll just say something here that the most, it's just crazy. We have a lot of sphagnum in the north of Europe, and yet most of the sphagnum that we buy comes from Netherlands, where it's imported from Chile and New Zealand, where sphagnum is not at all that common. And yet we have so much sphagnum. We have just hectare upon hectare upon hectare of sphagnum growing in citrus fruit plantations, which are going to be clear felled. And you clear fell it, you could take the sphagnum away, it was going to die, or it's going to be knocked back anyway, and you restock the site and the sphagnum comes back in 5 or 10 years. And nobody's been able to make it pay. It's crazy.
Gordon, is there a younger generation of bryologists coming on? I mean, we are all quite old now, but I mean, you know, how healthy is bryology?
It's quite healthy from one point of view. There are younger people coming along. There never needs to be a really high recruitment rate, because it's just not that big a society. But you know, obviously we do need people to come along. It tends to be people slightly later in life rather than the younger ones. But we did run an apprenticeship scheme at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and we had, I think that ran for three apprentices. Yeah, so Maren, the woman I talked about, and Julie Smith, who's again another young bryologist, and Oliver Moore, who some of you have already met. He was one of our apprentices, and there is talk now of a new apprentice scheme, so there will be another apprentice starting fairly shortly at RBGE. So it does happen. They do come along from different directions as well, and so in Scotland there are a couple of youngsters that I'll mention because you may come across them eventually. Rory Whittock, who lives in Granton, and Gus Routledge, who lives somewhere or other, near Loch Ness somewhere. I can't quite remember where he is, but they're both, well, I guess Rory is over 30, but Gus definitely is under 30. And so, yeah, the numbers come along. The really big problem is that there is no bryologist currently employed at any university in Britain as a bryologist. And what that means is that all the molecular work that's going on falls on a very small number of people at places like RBGE, Natural History Museum and the National Museum of Wales. Very few people, so there's not much of a career structure for these people, which means that people aren't keen to take it up. And it means that we don't have the academic background now. You know, when I go out into the field, I collect things because I'm not quite sure what they are, and I go back and I consult pretty hefty floras. And those are now, well, one of them, the Liverworts one is written by a woman called Jean Payton. She's now 96, I think. And so she's not going to be producing anything anymore. And Tony Smith's, the moss flora that Tony Smith wrote, he's been dead for 10 years. And I think the moss flora dates from the 1990s. And there have been enormous changes because of the molecular work since then. We don't have anybody in Britain now that's capable of writing that kind of academic work. We depend totally on people on the continent.
Were they still employed, people?
Yeah, quite a number of them are still employed here, particularly in Spain. Got lots and lots of bryologists in the university in Spain.
Yeah.
Excuse my voice. You used the phrase incredibly important several times. A short question to put to you is, what constitutes a very important?
In the context of conservation, we think of things that are rare and at the edge of their range as being important. And so, are they important in the greater scheme of things? Probably not, probably more important, rather than concentrating on the very important species. We ought to concentrate on habitat loss, which is the major problem, really. And so, but people are keen to work on rare things. They like to keep rare things going, and it's quite hard work trying to get funding for conservation for bryophytes. There are maps I could have shown. Well, I showed you the map for the global map for Scapani and Nimbosa with those 3 dots there. If I'd showed you a map of the distribution of the golden eagle, it would have taken all the way around the northern hemisphere of the globe. And yet you can just bet your life, well, you can just tell me the difference in funding that goes towards golden eagles compared with bryophytes. And yet really, you know, golden eagles are everywhere. So if you want to get money for things, you've got to create a case, and therefore you tend to use terminology like incredibly important.
It's a good question. It is working.
Good, well, thank you, Gordon. I'm so glad we got there in the end.
Yeah.
It took a year, but no, thanks for that. I think you've certainly encouraged me to go out and look more closely at what I'm tramping over, because just there's so much sort of out there.
I'm afraid
So if everyone would like to give a big warm thanks to Gordon.
Thank you.